Chapter 12 of The Radio Gunner by Alexander Forbes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Victim. At intelligence headquarters in Punta Delgada, there was an expert psychologist, versed in all the latest and most scientific methods of probing a man's veracity. With a sensitive galvanometer connected to the hands of the subject, he could detect the slightest emotional disturbance when no other evidence would reveal it. The morning after Long was taken ashore with the understanding that his skill as an electrician was to be utilized at headquarters, Barton explained to him that the task they wanted him for was one requiring presence of mind and other faculties for which they wished to give him a psychological test. Barton was well aware that as likely as not Long knew he was caught and was not to be fooled. But what if he did? They had him, and he would have to submit to their test in any case. And in any case, their tests would reveal what they wanted. Since uncertainty as to whether he was a prisoner or not was apt to increase Long's emotional instability, it seemed best to keep up the bluff of a bona fide test of his fitness. Long was placed in a comfortable chair with his hands in contact with electrodes connected with the galvanometer whose mirror threw a spot of light on a screen which the psychologist could watch, but which Long could not. The psychologist then asked him questions or analyzed his association processes with test words, observing the motion of the spot of light on the screen. Some questions were calculated to test his knowledge of electricity. Others were apparently frivolous and pointless. Whenever a question or word aroused an emotional response, the spot would make a quick excursion across the screen. After a series of idle-seeming questions, the psychologist made a remark which was not calculated to ruffle the composure of anyone except that it contained the name Wellman. Long continued to present an imperturbable exterior, but the spot of light made the largest excursion that had yet appeared. Some more unimportant patter followed, which permitted the spot of light to come to rest again. Another insignificant remark was made containing a casual reference to the name of Rich. The spot of light moved quickly on the screen and registered an even larger excursion than had followed the name of Wellman. At this juncture, Evans quietly entered the room through a door behind Long's back. At a signal from the psychologist, he addressed a casual remark to Barton. At the sound of his voice, the spot of light shot off the scale on the screen. When it had steadied again somewhat, Barton said to Evans, "By the way, you said you had some repairs to make on that small transmitter. Have you got it working all right this morning?" Again, the spot of light went off the scale. A pulse recording device showed Long's heart beating rapidly, and now beads of sweat stood out on his forehead. His agitated state was completely ignored, and the test went on, more innocuous talk being used to steady the spot of light. Barton then dropped a harmless remark to Evans about Commander Rich, and once again the spot jumped in a way that could never have been due to an instrumental error or chance. Long was then formally made prisoner. Scarcely had this job been completed when Barton and Evans were fairly stunned by the news that a dispatch had been received at communication headquarters ordering Captain Fraser detached from duty as Chief of Staff and to proceed immediately to Washington on whatever cruiser could best be spared from the fleet. What on earth could this mean? With the momentous preparations for action in progress, Fraser was never needed in the fleet as much as now. The obvious inference was that some crucial question had arisen in Washington, and he was wanted for a conference. Yet Evans could not escape the feeling that something was wrong. He could not help associating this new development with the activities of Long and Rich. As head of the radio division of the important Bureau of Engineering, Rich had the means at his hand of wielding vast power for evil. Very likely he had created a situation for recalling Fraser, knowing his to be the controlling mind in the fleet, and quite possibly he would contrive to have a swarm of enemy submarines lurking in the path of the cruiser that was to take him home, or perhaps a minefield would be laid across her path as she approached home waters. Perhaps some intrigue was afoot to get Fraser discredited and put on the shelf when he reached Washington. As a matter of fact, Rich was, at the moment, considering all these possibilities of turning to account the removal of Fraser from the fleet. Evans and Barton at once held a conference on the subject. Barton was at first inclined to assume that there was a good reason for Fraser's recall and to advise leaving matters alone until further developments should arise. He did not feel that there was adequate reason to suppose that Evans' secret method of communication had broken down. If it had not, Mortimer would already be investigating Rich, and any unnecessary use of the method would add to the danger of its discovery. If the method had broken down, any message Evans might send would go to Rich instead of to Mortimer, and would thus serve only to help the wrong man by giving him information and putting him on his guard. Finally, however, Evans succeeded in convincing Barton that a showdown might avert disaster and should be attempted at once. He therefore went to communication headquarters and began once more to test a transmitter. Late that afternoon, the same day that Mortimer had received the message about Fraser and acted on it, Rand received this message. Go to M in person. Put nothing on paper. Ask him verbally to repeat back to me all messages received from me in this way in the last 2 days. If you cannot do so, let me know. Avoid head of division. Danger. E. Tompkins had just left the office for his rooms, whence he had gone on his long and uncomfortable motor ride. Whatever caution and watchfulness Rand possessed was now thoroughly aroused. He felt as if all the sentries, yeomen, and orderlies in the bureau were watching him. Taking pains not to digress in any particular from his usual routine, he put on his hat and coat and started home. But when he had reached a corridor where he was unobserved, he took a roundabout way to the secretary's office, where he found Mortimer just getting ready to go home. Mortimer frowned as Rand repeated his message to him. "What's troubling Jim now?" he said to himself. "Is he still having notions about Rich?" Then he said aloud to Rand, "Was there nothing more?" "No, sir." "Well," said Mortimer, "the only message I've received from him for some time was as follows. Recall Fraser to Washington at once. Urgent. You can repeat that back to him and tell him that is all." "When did that come?" said Rand. "This morning," said Mortimer. "Commander Rich sent it to me by special messenger when Tompkins was called away." "Tompkins called away? Where?" "Commander Rich said he had been wired for because his wife was very sick. He had barely time to catch his train, so the commander delivered the message for him." "His wife sick?" echoed Rand. "He's not married." "Then perhaps it was his mother. I forget which," said Mortimer. "But he's been working in the bureau all day. I saw him walk out of the office not half an hour ago." When Commander Rich planned his trick, he knew nothing of Rand's part in the system. His only intimations were the message of warning from Long and the report of the spies he had posted in consequence of that warning, to the effect that Tompkins had been seen trying to find the secretary. He had taken a gambler's chance, and not an unreasonable one, that Mortimer would hear nothing of an obscure employee in the bureau between the time of his alleged departure and the time when his kidnappers should get him away from the city. But his gambler's luck had failed him. Mortimer was thunderstruck. The message Rand had brought him took on a new meaning. A council of war was held to guard against interception or leakage in the exchange of messages with Evans, which must now proceed as rapidly as possible till the mystery should be cleared up. Rand was told to repeat back to Evans the message about Fraser at once. In half an hour, Evans in the radio station at Punta Delgada received it, with difficulty containing his feelings, lest the operators about him should be started speculating about what did not concern them. Without waiting to tell Barton what had happened, he sent back the following. "Message as repeated was never sent from here. True message was this. We have evidence suggesting that the man I warned you against last spring is involved in treason. Watch him closely. Today, more evidence has appeared in confirmation. Fraser, sorely needed in fleet, is already on board cruiser bound for States." Nervously, Mortimer and Rand waited, discussing the ominous possibilities of this crisis, till the message from Punta Delgada arrived. Then Mortimer broke all records for speed in doing two things. One was to tell the Chief of Naval Intelligence what had happened. The other was to cable Punta Delgada, canceling the orders, recalling Fraser, and directing him to return at once to the fleet. Captain Fraser, turning over his duties to the Assistant Chief of Staff, had boarded a fast scout cruiser and left the harbor of Punta Delgada for the open sea late in the evening. The night was dark, and by midnight the island of St. Michael's had disappeared astern when Fraser was roused from his sleep by a messenger with word that an important radio message for him had just been received. To his surprise, he found he had been directed to return at once to Punta Delgada. "Well, what next, I wonder," he said to himself. "Something damn funny seems to be going on." He sent back a radio ordering the arrangements to be made for opening the gates in the nets to allow the cruiser to return to harbor, and then, going up on the bridge, told the officer of the deck to change course 180 degrees and return to port. Before dawn, the cruiser was back at her moorings in the harbor. Barton and Evans had both agreed that they had best continue to keep to themselves the secret of Evans's confidential relations with Mortimer, and especially his secret method of communicating with Washington. Barton, therefore, called on Fraser and merely explained that he had been advised through secret channels from Washington that Fraser's recall had resulted in some way from the intrigue of a group of spies, and that their plot had been discovered in time to cancel the orders immediately after they were issued. Meanwhile in Washington, Mortimer, as soon as he received the message from Punta Delgada revealing the trick and casting suspicion on Rich, went to Admiral Ralston, Chief of Naval Intelligence, and discussed the problem with him. This officer cautioned him against taking anything for granted. "Clearly, a dangerous spy is at work," he said, "but let us not be too hasty in placing the guilt. It behooves us to be cautious about concluding that a man in Commander Rich's position is guilty of treason. The spy, whoever he is, will use every means he can think of to make the blame appear unmistakably to fall on someone else. It is easy to tap wires, you know." "That's so," said Mortimer. "What is the best move?" "I advise you to go to Commander Rich tomorrow morning and, without intimating that anything is amiss, refer to your telephone conversation. If he does not deny having such a conversation, ask him to explain the discrepancy about Tompkins. You can judge from his conversation whether he's in a hole or whether someone else has framed the thing up." Mortimer passed an uneasy night. The next morning he went to the office of Commander Rich. While he had been in bed, the message which caused Fraser to turn back to Punta Delgada had been sent and received, and his ship, turning back, had already reached the harbor. It was by no miracle that these facts had found their way to certain persons in Washington who had to do with radio apparatus, nor was it surprising that the man who controlled all radio apparatus at its source got wind of them before Mortimer made his call. Before Mortimer was up and about, Commander Rich sent for a certain henchman named Goss, and in the privacy of his room spoke to him thus: "When the supreme test of duty comes, the faithful will not fail. Our ruse has been betrayed. Yesterday morning, I told the secretary that Tompkins had been called away by family sickness. The chances were 1,000 to 1 he would never hear that Tompkins was in the bureau after I said he had gone. By some mischance, his suspicions have been aroused. Last night, he canceled orders issued in the morning. Soon, he will come to question me. It is of supreme importance for the cause we serve that I should stay at my post. I shall deny the telephone conversation and tell him someone has played a trick and impersonated me. But that will not suffice. To make my position secure, I must find someone who can mimic my voice well enough to have deceived the secretary. Your power of mimicry deceived Tompkins. You will be called on to show what you can do, avowedly for another purpose, and you must play your part. I do you the honor to call on you for this sacrifice." An agonized look spread over the face of Goss. "Master, is there no other way?" he said. "None," replied Rich. "I must stay, and you must go. The cause demands it. By good fortune, you may yet escape the extreme penalty. We must also have evidence of tampering with the wires. Go quickly to the bureau before anyone is about and, in a well-concealed place, cut the wires from the switchboard to Tompkins' desk. Then splice them together again and put tape around the splices. When you are questioned, protest your innocence till the case is proved against you. Own no master nearer than Constantinople. Tompkins will not return, but remember, you know nothing of that. When Mortimer called on Commander Rich at his office that morning, Rich received him with disarming cordiality and equanimity. Indeed, he did not look like a guilty man. "Do you recall our telephone conversation yesterday morning?" said Mortimer. "No," said Rich with a puzzled look. "I had forgotten we had one. What was it about?" "About Tompkins." "Tompkins?" said Rich. "Who is he?" "An expert radio aide in your division. You said he had a message for me." "I know the man you mean now. We have several aides, and I see so little of them individually I am apt to forget their names. But I recall nothing about any message. What was it?" "You said he had a message he wished to deliver to me in person, but was in a great hurry to catch a train because of serious illness in his family. For that reason, you undertook to deliver the message by special messenger." "Mr. Secretary, I am certain that I had no such conversation with you. This is the first I have heard of it. Someone else must have impersonated me." "That is strange," said Mortimer, "for it was I that called this bureau. I had received the message and, being surprised at its contents, I called up the radio division and asked for Tompkins. I was answered by your voice saying, 'Commander Rich speaking,' and following with the statement I just told you. I have since learned that the message as delivered to me was quite different from that which was originally sent." "Most extraordinary," said Rich, frowning. "There must be someone up to mischief." He thought a moment, then resumed. "Someone understanding the wires could have cut them and connected them with a portable phone. But how was it that I heard your voice? A good mimic could easily have deceived you over the telephone. Was the message very important?" "Very." "This looks like a serious plot," said Rich. "Some enemy agent must have access to the wires in our bureau. Most probably he has been planted in the bureau itself. I will track this thing down at once." "Hadn't you better get in touch with the Bureau of Naval Intelligence about it?" said Mortimer. "Yes, I'll get them to send over a man who is good on wiring and that sort of thing," said Rich. "With a clue like this, we should be able to find the culprit shortly. We can question some of the officers and a few of the more trustworthy draftsmen and yeomen as to who was in the vicinity of those wires yesterday morning. I haven't a doubt we shall find our man." Mortimer returned to Admiral Ralston in the Bureau of Naval Intelligence and told him of the interview. Rich had seemed so thoroughly in earnest he could not help but believe in his ignorance of the whole affair, especially since in his own opening question to Rich he had not even hinted that anything was wrong. He had merely asked if he recalled the conversation. If Rich had been the villain, why should he have changed his tactics overnight before receiving any intimation that the message had been changed? Why should he not have stood by his story of the day before? It all looked as if the spy were someone else. Admiral Ralston concurred in this view. They would give Rich what help he needed in finding the spy, and await results. That very afternoon, Rich called at the room of Secretary Mortimer. He already had two very important clues. A place had been found where the wires to Tompkins' desk had recently been cut and then spliced together again. This explained the method whereby someone impersonating Rich had been substituted for Tompkins on the line. Besides this, a certain chief electrician named Goss had been seen with a portable telephone going through some of the rooms in that vicinity yesterday morning. Goss was a man of unknown antecedents who looked like a Southern European of some sort. He had been known to entertain the others by mimicry on one occasion. Rich proposed that, by way of a trap, they approach Goss and tell him they have some special detective work in which his help is desired, that they understand he is a fair mimic and would like to see what he can do, since that faculty will be of assistance. "I feel confident that he is our man," said Rich, "if we show no signs of suspecting him, but offer him the prospect of receiving increased confidence. It will be just what he wants, and he will probably display his talent. We can then confront him with the cut wires and the evidence that someone was tampering with the line yesterday, and that none but he could have done it. It is not unlikely that he will then break down and confess." Mortimer agreed to this ruse and went with Rich to his office, where they met Admiral Ralston, who recalled the name of Goss as being under suspicion of tampering with some radio gear. Goss was summoned, and Rich explained to him that the secretary wished a good electrician for certain special duty requiring resource and presence of mind, and that he, Rich, had selected him as a good candidate for the task. Mortimer then questioned Goss as to his experience. Then Rich addressed him. "The secretary tells me that in this work there may be occasion for you to imitate the voice of another over the telephone. They tell me that one day you amused the men in the drafting room by mimicking some other members of the division. If you can do that, it will be very useful." "I was just doing it for fun," said Goss. "I don't know as I could really fool anyone." "Let me hear you mimic Commander Rich," said Mortimer. Upon this, Goss said a characteristic sentence in which he aped the voice and manner of his master with such skill that Mortimer laughed and Rich blushed in spite of himself. Goss glanced at Rich for an instant. In the glance, Rich saw a look of pathetic appeal, and even in his hard and cruel heart there was a shadow of admiration and pity as he realized how his henchman had shown his talent at its best, though the revelation sealed his doom. Rich cast a knowing glance at Mortimer, who saw the convincing significance of the demonstration. The action then moved swiftly. Admiral Ralston took the lead and told Goss they wanted him to look over some wires with them. Then he led the way, followed by Mortimer, Rich, and Goss, to the severed wires, and suddenly, lifting the plank that hid them, turned sharply on Goss, saying, "We want to know who cut and spliced those wires." Goss, true to his master, appeared confused and disconcerted, then, with a visible effort to regain his composure, professed his ignorance of the matter. Mortimer and Rich looked on as Admiral Ralston grilled his victim. At last they wrung from him a confession that he served the Sultan, but when questioned as to his confederates, he stoutly insisted that he was his own master. Headquarters in Constantinople had sent him, and from none other had he taken orders. With the fatalism of the Muslim, he faced his execution. Rich was now more strongly entrenched than ever in the good graces of the Navy Department. His promptitude in finding the real spy had won him the warmest commendation. The day after Goss had confessed to cutting the wires and impersonating Commander Rich, Mortimer instructed Rand to send a secret message to Evans informing him that the original suspect had been exonerated and had in fact assisted them in finding the real spy, who was now imprisoned under a strong guard and awaiting execution. When Evans received this message, his mind was troubled. He conferred again with Barton and told him he was not satisfied. "I'll bet my last dollar that scoundrel is the guilty one," he said. "He's just pulling their legs." He reviewed the evidence in detail. "I believe you're right," said Barton, "but it's hard to convince them at this distance. I didn't tell you," he continued after a pause, "what I learned about the Sheridan affair." "What was it?" "You recall that when the Sheridan asked for bearings, Forthcliffe was reported out of commission, and Gloucester gave a bearing that was found afterwards to have been 16 degrees in error? I sent one of the best intelligence officers in the Bureau to investigate. He found that a certain chief radio electrician named Goss from the Bureau of Engineering had been to Forthcliffe early that morning to inspect the station, and had come to Gloucester at noon. He was alone in the radio compass shack there for a few minutes just after lunch, and again about dusk, just after the Sheridan went aground. The most careful examination of the apparatus revealed nothing definite, but the set screw which holds the circular scale in place looked as if it had recently been tightened." "My God!" cried Evans. "What a jackass I was for not getting on to that. It fits into the rest like a piece in a picture puzzle. Look here, the activities of those two men, Goss and Long must have been carefully planned beforehand. One of the most puzzling things of all was the way those three bearings, although two of them were wildly inaccurate, checked up with each other well enough to convince a careful navigator in a fog. If the gear had been thrown out of tune by haphazard amounts, they never would have given bearings so consistent with each other, except by the merest chance. Those devils must have decided where they wanted to locate the ship in order to put her aground. Then they must have worked out the errors scientifically in the light of the ship's actual position, and they did a damn smart job of it. Possibly Long sent a message from the ship in some secret code telling Goss where they were so that he could calculate the desired error, said Barton. That's the most probable bet, said Evans. Anyway, it shows clearly that there was careful planning from some headquarters of deviltry, which, unless I am much mistaken, means rich. Goss is being watched, but thus far we haven't pinned anything on him, said Barton. No suspicion of Rich has been mentioned hitherto. Seems to me, said Evans, it's up to you to go to Washington as quick as you can get there and have him strung up. Barton looked perplexed. It would be rather hard to arrange, he said, and would attract attention that might prove embarrassing. Then, too, it might be very hard to pin anything on Rich with the evidence we have at present. He's so clever and so well entrenched, he can probably work all kinds of alibis. I think perhaps the best policy is just to keep the lid on tight out here and not let any strategic messages go out to Washington at all. But he may have other men like Long planted here in the fleet with all kinds of secret methods of sending messages in code, said Evans. It's too dangerous to let a man like that stay where he can function as the brains of the whole intrigue. We don't know how he may contrive to cripple us. If he gets on to the secret of Wellman's codebook, we've lost a weapon worth many ships. As to evidence, I'll bet I can get some information straight from headquarters through Kendrick and Herringham. Barton shook his head. I wouldn't, he said. Sending names of persons, even disguised in as good a code as yours, involves a terrible risk. It's a terrible risk if we don't, said Evans earnestly. We are staking the whole war on our naval strategy, and what will all our strategy avail with a thing like this at the heart of our communication system in Washington? Every bit of evidence we can get may be needed to dislodge him. The risk of leakage in communicating with Herringham is nothing to the risk of leaving Rich where he is. Barton thought a while. You are right, he said at last. Send your message to Herringham, and when we hear from him, I'll see whether it's best to go to Washington or what to do. Once more, Evans tested a transmitter. For 24 hours he waited on pins and needles, and during those 24 hours, both Kendrick and Herringham lost some sleep too. Also, someone in Constantinople who knew how to make Bella talk did so. The return message, which Evans deciphered from the radio traffic at Gibraltar, caused him to go to Barton and urge on him more insistently than ever the importance of his going at once to Washington. Thereupon Barton made a call on Captain Fraser, and in consequence of this call, some unusual orders were drawn up and signed. The same day as the conference with Barton, which resulted in the message to Herringham, Evans happened to pass and send Coffee on the deck of the flagship Delaware. Coffee glared savagely at him, realizing that, though he did not know why or how, some power above himself had caused the punishment he had sought to inflict on this insubordinate warrant officer to be so mitigated as to amount to little or nothing. At least, here he was walking the deck as freely as ever, but 4 days after his attempt to jump ship, when he should by rights still be confined to his room, if not in irons. That reminds me, said Evans to himself, that there's one more bit of house cleaning needed on this ship. I better attend to that now before I forget it. He knew that his agents in the Bureau of Engineering were now able to handle his messages to Mortimer. So he went to the radio room and once again tested a transmitter. With his hand on the key, he made the cryptic dots and dashes, which the powerful transmitter translated into silent ether waves speeding across the sea, while the operator on watch sat listlessly by, waiting for him to finish. "The gear's working well," said Evans. Then, rising, handed the headphones back to the operator and returned to his room, where he got out some warm clothing and made ready for a long journey on which he must travel light. The next morning in Washington, Rand transmitted to Secretary Mortimer the following message: "Get Ensign J.L. Coffee transferred as far away from flagship as possible. Can recommend him wherever red tape is needed. E." Later in the day, Evans was talking things over with Elkins in the radio room when a yeoman from the coding room handed Elkins a dispatch. He opened it and read, "Detach Ensign Coffee to proceed immediately to Washington. Report Bureau Navigation." Elkins handed the dispatch to Evans, saying, "I wonder what in the hell they want him in Washington for." "That's an interesting matter for speculation," said Evans, and went about his work. When Coffee received his orders, he was in the act of boasting to some of the other ensigns of the way he had carried out the instructions of no less an official than Commander Rich to squelch insubordination in the warrant officers under him, should he see any. He was telling how he was getting that man Evans to toe the mark, and how he was going to give him some more medicine before he got through. His jaw fell when he read the dispatch. The other ensigns tittered. "Save your medicine for someone else, Coffee," said one. "Be sure you don't swallow any of it yourself by mistake," said another. Coffee, however, though profoundly chagrined, soon convinced himself that there must be an important mission awaiting him in Washington. End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Radio Gunner by Alexander Forbes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Showdown. In 1919, when the NC-4, the colossal flying boat built for the purpose by the American Navy, made her epoch-making flight across the ocean, there was, among many others, one great difficulty surpassing the rest, which made the task well nigh impossible. The distance from Newfoundland to the Azores was so great that the problem of building a machine with the hull strong enough to alight safely on the waves with a load of fuel sufficient for the journey, yet still able to lift the required weight off the water, taxed the available engineering talent to the limit. When all that had been deemed essential was put aboard, the boats were actually unable to rise into the air. Something had to be discarded. The margin of fuel above what the flight would consume was already so small that the commanding officer was unwilling to reduce it further. Therefore, the emergency radio transmitter was left behind, and in consequence, the NC-3, flagship of the flight, was nearly lost with all on board. This much is history, but let us get on with our story. In the years between 1919 and 1937, science and engineering had done wonders, but they had not lessened the number of miles between Newfoundland and the Azores, nor enabled seaplanes to fly without fuel, nor to alight on ocean waves without strong hulls. The problem of flying seaplanes across the ocean under their own power was still acute. Seaplanes manufactured in the States were needed in steadily increasing numbers at the great center of naval activity in the Azores. Cargo space on ships could ill be spared for their transportation. They must transport themselves. But instead of attempting to cross the wide ocean in a single hop, they divided the journey into two stages by means of a great floating hangar midway between Newfoundland and Fayal. Thus, the load of fuel required was cut in two. This floating hangar was little more than a glorified scow with a huge sea anchor to windward and engines of just power enough to supplement this in holding her against drifting away from her station when the wind was strong. Two long arms or wings projecting to the leeward from her hull enclosed a large sheltered pool, and giant plates extending deep down under the water from the flanks of these arms broke the waves so that even in the heaviest gales the surface of the pool was smooth enough for the planes to alight. Fuel tanks, repair shop, quarters for crew of hangar and of passing seaplanes, fast seagoing motorboats for rescue and salvage work, and storage space for a few planes comprised the rest of the equipment. A gray, lifeless dusk was about to close in on this lonely floating station the day after Barton had called on Fraser. In a deckhouse was a sort of wardroom where were wont to gather the officers in charge and the pilots of such planes as were attached to the station or had stopped there in passing. A group of pilots was sitting round the table looking over the latest weather bulletin received by radio. This promised a clearing of the sky before morning. The sky had been overcast for 2 days, and the officers now began their usual custom on such occasions of getting up a pool with bets on the number of miles off station that the navigator would find them to be with his early morning star sights. One man bet as high as 10 miles. "That's absurd," said another. "They know just what the ocean currents are around here by now, and they've got indicators to show just what drift the old scow makes. They're always making allowances for all that. I don't believe we'll be over 3 miles off. I'm from Missouri on this dead reckoning with a scow riding to a sea anchor and a one-horse engine to get home with," said the first. "Well," said the other, "you back your notion with your dough and I'll back mine. If it clears off like they say it will, we'll see tomorrow who's the richer for the deal." The skeptic rose from the table, yawned, stretched, and sauntered to the window, where he looked out over the endless gray waste of water on which the leaden sky was already beginning to cast the gloom of approaching twilight. "Gosh, what a dreary place this is," he said. "I hope they won't keep me stuck in this billet many weeks. The monotony of it will just about drive me silly." "That's the kind of thing you've got to expect in war," said another officer, older than the rest, one that was permanently attached to the floating hangar. "I'd give my eye teeth," said the skeptic, "to be out where there's something doing, looking for enemy subs to bomb. Good Lord, all we do here is go out to find some blighter who can't keep his engine running and has flopped on the water, and tell him cheerio while he waits for the motorboat to come and salvage him. Why can't they teach these bums to fly before sending them out here with brand new planes anyway?" "If they did that, you'd have even less to occupy you than you have now," said the older man. "As for hunting subs, I bet you'd find that a damn sight more monotonous than this. Here you at least find the blighter you're looking for." The conversation was suddenly interrupted by the signal, "Action stations!" The pilots ran to their planes, and the older officer ran to his station in the pilot house, where he found the commanding officer studying the eastern sky with his binoculars. "What's up?" he asked. "A big seaplane coming this way," answered the commanding officer. "She looks like an American plane, but we're not expecting any from there, and we've had no radio from Punta Delgada or Fale that would indicate any plane was coming, so I called out the gun crew to be ready in case of trouble. Give a recognition signal. She's near enough now to see it." The signal was flashed out, a series of brilliant colored lights, and instantly the answering signal was seen to flash from the approaching seaplane, already visible to the naked eye. "She's American, all right," said the skipper, "but what's she doing coming here now? I thought they needed all their planes right there, and why haven't we had any word of her coming?" The roar of the 4 big engines was already audible, and soon the great plane, with her wing spread of 100 feet, swung round to leeward of the hangar, swooped down, hovered low over the waves, and settled gracefully on the smooth surface of the water between the sheltering arms of the giant scow. The great seaplane was warped into the landing stage, and down from the hull clambered her pilot, followed by Barton, Evans, and the prisoner, Long. "Where's the captain?" asked Barton of the seaman who helped him onto the landing stage. "Right here," said the skipper, hastening down from the pilot house. Barton handed him a slip of paper. He looked at it, then turned quickly to his orderly. Tell Mr. Jones I want to see him at once. Commander Barton, come to my room and I'll have supper for you right away. The gunners can go to the wardroom. I'll have the plane ready for you to go on in half an hour." Lieutenant Jones, the executive officer, appeared on the run and saluted. "Mr. Jones, have the tanks of this seaplane filled with gas and oil. Have the engine carefully inspected and the best emergency crew fully equipped and ready to take her. They are going on to Trepassey Bay, and everything must be ready in half an hour. Have supper for the crew that brought her in. They'll stay here." The skeptic was told that he was to take the big seaplane on the next lap of her journey. The monotony was to break more abruptly than he had hoped. Never had the routine of this floating relay station been so violently shaken. Today, a new record for speed was made, for the slip of paper called for speed, and it bore the signature of Admiral Johnson. In arranging with Fraser for the trip, Barton had told him nothing of his confidential relations with Evans, but merely stated that since the case involved tampering with the radio gear in the flagship, which Evans had discovered, he wanted to take him along as a witness. In half an hour, as the tired crew that had brought the giant seaplane on her flight from the Azores, refreshed by hot coffee and cigarettes, were beginning to wonder how long they were doomed to stay at this lonely spot in mid-ocean, Barton, Evans, and Long climbed aboard the seaplane once more. Long was shackled to his seat so that he could not by a sudden leap deprive them of his services as a witness. The skeptic took his place in the pilot's seat, and with a deafening roar from her engines, the great creature rose off the water and shot away into the twilight, where she was almost instantly lost to view. Looking back 10 minutes later, the pilot saw twinkling faintly astern the light on the floating hangar that guided seaplanes to this haven of rest and refuge on the lonely sea. It was only just after 2 in the morning when the commanding officer of the great seaplane base at Trepassey Bay, Newfoundland, was roused from his sleep and handed a slip of paper which caused him to spring out of bed and order the best seaplane at the base to be ready at once to take passengers to Halifax. At Halifax, they stopped for breakfast while a fresh plane was being prepared to make a non-stop flight to Washington. Before 9, they were on their way again, dropping the islands and promontories of the Nova Scotia coast behind them at a rate of 90 miles an hour. As they passed over the heel of Cape Cod, flying high, Evans could make out the long white line of Monomoy Island with its sandy ocean beach. The memory returned to him of the same white line when last he had seen it over the roaring breakers, showing dimly through the rain from the Petrel's cockpit on his adventurous sail with Mortimer. It was toward the end of the afternoon that the strange trio arrived in Washington, quite unheralded. With the utmost care to keep Evans concealed from Rich's possible spies, Barton found Mortimer and brought him secretly to the place where Evans was awaiting them. Mortimer told them all that had transpired in Washington and how Rich had found in Goss the real culprit. Then they in turn recited the evidence they had obtained at the Azores implicating Rich, the behavior of Long, and his visible agitation on the mention of Rich's name seemed to Mortimer suggestive but not conclusive. So did the testimony of Elkins concerning Rich's advice to Captain Brigham. But this, having passed through so many months, carried less weight than the other. The report of Herringham, however, made him feel that the case indeed looked bad for Rich. After some consultation, it was decided that, unknown to Rich, Mortimer should assemble Admiral Ralston, Chief of Naval Intelligence, Barton, and Evans in his office, and then send for Rich and question him. Long would be held under guard where he could easily be brought in, and Commander White could be summoned at any time from the Bureau of Engineering to repeat the significant words of Captain Brigham if it seemed desirable. The next morning, Evans and Barton were smuggled into Mortimer's office with every precaution that no word of their presence should reach the ears of Commander Rich. Admiral Ralston then came, and all sat down where they could watch the face of Rich as he entered the door. Rich was then requested to come to the secretary's office. So cordial had been their relations that he now felt sure all suspicion of him had vanished, and he obeyed the summons without misgivings. With breathless suspense, the others awaited his arrival. The door was opened by an orderly, and Rich entered. All eyes were on him. As he saw Evans sitting before him, his face blanched visibly, and there was the least suggestion of a tightening of his muscles. But in an instant he was all cordiality, his self-possession never better. "This is an unexpected pleasure," he said to Evans. "I hadn't heard you were returning from the fleet so soon." "You wouldn't," answered Evans. "The Bureau keeps you occupied with larger issues." "Indeed," replied Rich graciously. "I hear often of the splendid work you have been doing for us in the fleet in keeping our equipment in working order." Equally gracious was Rich in his greetings to Barton and Admiral Ralston. Then Mortimer, bracing himself for the effort, spoke. "Commander Rich," he said, "I regret to say that a man from your division of the Bureau of Engineering was found purposely damaging the radio apparatus on the Delaware under pretense of making changes indicated in orders from you." "Indeed," said Rich, his composure not the least bit ruffled, yet with an appropriate display of surprise. "And what was his name and rating?" "Radio Gunner Long," answered Mortimer. "Do you remember him?" "I think I recall his name," said Rich, "but we have so many in the Bureau, I find it hard to know them all. At all events, I should not have been directly concerned with planning the work of such a man. The officers under me lay out the work and make out the orders. They merely bring them to Admiral Bishop or me to sign. It would be impossible for me to give any clue to this particular case offhand, but I can start an investigation at once, and we can probably trace his orders to their source." "Unhappily," said Mortimer, "evidence was brought to light which appeared to point unmistakably to you as the real author of the plan to damage the apparatus." "Mr. Secretary," said Rich, with impressive dignity and earnestness, "it is impossible that you have given credence to such slanderous accusation after our years of close and cordial cooperation in the prosecution of the war." "Indeed," said Mortimer, "I was loath to listen to them till the mass of evidence seemed overwhelming." "It must indeed have been overwhelming to outweigh my years of devoted service to the Navy. May I ask what this overwhelming evidence is?" A number of things about the behavior of this man Long appeared to those who apprehended him only capable of interpretation as signifying your complicity with his acts. These facts, coupled with the changing of messages last week and the simultaneous disappearance of Mr. Tompkins, which present indications seem to show are not as easily explained as you made them appear to be then through the agency of Goss, have led to the accusation. All these things can still be perfectly well explained. Goss confessed to tapping the wires and impersonating me, as you yourself can witness. Tompkins was probably himself implicated, and, hearing of Goss's fate, has either absconded or committed suicide. The evidence associated with this man Long you speak of can be explained on proper investigation as easily as all the rest. I think, Mr. Secretary, you are doing me an extraordinary injustice to so much as listen to these accusations after my years of devoted service. Perhaps the gunner here, indicating Evans, who has at times been impatient with me for not accepting newfangled ideas as quickly as he would like, has been poisoning your mind against me." "Since you bring up that issue," said Evans, "I should like to ask why, if you are indeed the gallant and loyal officer you modestly concede yourself to be, you told Captain Brigham the Delaware would be better off without the equipment you had authorized to enable her to direct the fleet in action." A dark scowl showed for an instant on Rich's face. "It's a lie," he said. "I never said such a thing to Captain Brigham or anyone else." Evans turned to Mortimer. "Commander White's testimony on that point might be interesting," he said. Commander White was summoned. When he entered the room, Mortimer said to him, "Commander White, I wish to know if Captain Brigham, while Chief of Staff, ever said anything to you about remarks by Commander Rich to him on the subject of the radio equipment of the Delaware." "He did say something about that, sir." "Do you remember what he said?" "It is some time ago, But, as I recall it, Gunner Evans had just said something to him about the set not being in good working order according to the specifications of the Bureau, and he had told the gunner the set was the way he wanted it. When Gunner Evans had gone, Captain Brigham told me that Commander Rich had said he didn't believe in most of the newer equipment, and he thought it would be just as well not to attempt to keep it all in working order, but to rely in practice on the old-fashioned gear. Commander Rich then said, "I don't recall making any such remarks as that. Captain Brigham and I had frequent conversations, and at some time I may have said that some of the older gear had stood up well in service and was in some ways more reliable than some of the newer devices. Mr. Secretary, you know how easy it is to misquote a man, even with the best of intentions. Some remark of mine has been misunderstood and then passed from mouth to mouth till it actually is held up as evidence of treason. The thing is ludicrous. I never dreamed of advocating anything that would impair the efficiency of the ships." Evans spoke next. The efficiency of the Delaware's radio room as it was in Captain Brigham's regime might well be likened to that of a Ford car with one cylinder working and no front wheels. In spacing the battleship divisions most effectively for the concentration of gunfire, in disposing the cruiser squadrons and destroyer flotillas, every bit of modern equipment authorized by the Bureau is needed. Messages must often go out simultaneously on as many as 5 different wavelengths. With the gear, as Captain Brigham had it, that would be absolutely impossible. The teamwork of the fleet would be crude and clumsy. Worse, it would be paralyzed. Our ships, rambling incoherently over the ocean, would be at the mercy of the enemy if ever they were brought to action. That is what Brigham's efficiency stood for. "Mr. Secretary," said Rich with dignity, "I have already told you that I never advocated any neglect of radio equipment which could have impaired the efficiency of the fleet. The gunner here is obsessed by an exaggerated sense of importance of certain devices in whose development he has been interested. When he found them not working as well as he would have liked, and Captain Brigham not as much interested in them as he was, he built out of some misquoted remark of mine an elaborate picture of high treason." Evans shrugged his shoulders and looked at Barton. The case against Rich did not appear on the face of it as clear and convincing as it had been before the defendant's eloquent tongue had been mobilized in his defense. But Barton held in his hand a strong card of which he had as yet given no intimation. During the night, after hearing from Mortimer how Goss had been caught and driven to confess, he had interviewed Long. He now rose and went to a door leading to an adjoining room, opened it, and beckoned Long to come in. As he entered, all eyes were not on him, but on Rich. When this officer saw the prisoner enter, he started and turned pale. To the watchful eyes of Barton, the look of guilt on his face was unmistakable. Mortimer was rather struck by the ease with which he regained his composure after the surprise of seeing one whom he thought to be in the Azores suddenly brought before him. Barton then handed to Mortimer the original orders under which Long had been sent to Punta Delgada, formally signed by Admiral Bishop as chief of the Bureau. Mortimer read the orders, then questioned Long as to his mission and how he had come to be sent on it. Long's voice trembled as he answered. "Commander Rich explained to me that my task was to damage the radio equipment on the flagship, and later on the division flagships, as much as I could without its being discovered in time to repair it. Before I went, he called me to his office in the Bureau, where we looked over the diagrams of most of the apparatus and considered the best places to damage the sets in a way that would not be found out till they were called on for heavy usage. After making a few suggestions, he left it to me to work out the details." "This is the most preposterous fabrication I have heard yet," called out Rich in high dudgeon. "Just a moment," said Mortimer. "I wish to ask Gunner Long a few more questions. Then we can have your comments." Then, turning again to Long, he continued, "How did you come to be in the service, and how did your relations with Commander Rich come about?" "Goss and I were working as electricians in a factory in New York where they make radio apparatus. We had been in this country since we were boys. I came from Bulgaria and he from Thrace. Just before this country joined the war, Commander Rich, in civilian clothes, came to see us and talked with us for a long time, asking us what we knew of electricity and how we felt about the war. We both were on the side of the Balkan powers in our hearts and had no feeling of obligation to America. He told us this country was soon going into the war and that the rulers in Constantinople had things so well planned and organized that they were sure to win, and America would then be under their rule, and anyone who had helped the cause would be in luck. Finding us disposed to work for that end, he told us that he was an agent of the Constantinople government and had been holding a position in the United States Navy for some years, and showed us documents proving his statement. He offered us jobs in the Bureau of Engineering with the salaries of our ratings, and in addition an equal amount from a secret source at his disposal. We both accepted the offer, and as I was the older and more experienced, I was made a radio gunner, while Goss was enrolled as chief radio electrician. He promised us both rewards, either in money or good positions, at the close of the war, and assured us he would then control great power. Goss was my best friend in the world. No man was ever more faithful. Never did a man face the dangers of that work more bravely or more cheerfully than he. If Commander Rich had stood by him, nothing on earth would have made me tell. Till yesterday I stood ready to keep my mouth shut even if you tortured me. But last night I learned how this cur had betrayed my friend and foully done him to death. And now I am ready and glad to tell you the truth. Goss never faltered. He was ever ready at the master's bidding to risk discovery, tapping wires and impersonating others. When Rich found himself cornered, he turned to Goss and ordered him to reveal his mimicry that he himself might escape the net. All eyes were on Rich. His face wore a sneering look. "Mr. Secretary," he said, "it seems to me that story is pretty thin. I might almost say transparent. You, as a lawyer, have doubtless seen through it yourself already. This man is a spy. We all know that. He was caught in the act of doing the work he has just described. Goss was his friend. They were confederates. Now that he has been caught and his plan frustrated, he naturally wants to shift the burden of guilt, as much of it as will shift, onto the shoulders of someone else. Whom will he try to implicate? Naturally, the head of the division in charge of radio apparatus. It would help his case to do so anyway. And now that he finds on his return that I discovered his friend and confederate and caused his execution, naturally his desire for revenge makes him all the more eager to accuse me. With two motives, both strong, one might almost predict in advance that he would do just this. As for his story, anyone who wanted could invent it in 10 minutes. Surely you will not be so simple as to believe it." Long was seeing red. The storm of pent-up feeling brewing as Rich delivered these remarks now broke. "You vile scoundrel!" cried the prisoner. "Goss served you to the last, and you betrayed him. You made him use the skill that had served you to bring on his own death sentence, to save your dirty hide." "Mr. Secretary," said Rich, "on my honor, I am innocent. A man of your experience will not take the word of a confessed spy with an obvious grievance against that of an officer tried by years of service in the Navy." "Probably not, if that were the only evidence," said Mortimer. "I demand of you, in the interest of fair play," said Rich earnestly, "that Admiral Bishop, chief of the Bureau of Engineering, be permitted to come and speak in my defense. I am certain he will assure you of my innocence." "Very well," said Mortimer. "I will send for him at once." In a few moments Admiral Bishop was ushered in, looking more pompous, his face redder and his whiskers whiter than ever. Mortimer told him briefly the story of the suspicions and charges and summarized Rich's defense. Admiral Bishop could hardly contain his indignation. "This is the most outrageous frame-up against a loyal officer that I ever heard of," he said. "Commander Rich has been my right-hand man throughout the war. He has contributed more than anyone in Washington to the high state of preparedness of the Navy today. Ask any man who has been close to the organization of radio communications in the fleet during recent months if the efficiency of the apparatus is not a signal tribute to the responsible man at the head." "We have just heard from one man who has been very close to the radio communications in the fleet," said Barton, "and he didn't seem to look on their efficiency in that light." "Who?" asked Bishop. "Evans," replied Barton. "He seems to feel that our communications are working well in spite of Commander Rich, not because of him." "The gunner here?" said Admiral Bishop in surprise. "You don't expect me to yield to a radio gunner in my judgment of the men in charge of the divisions of my bureau?" "No," said Barton. "Only you said, 'Ask any man who has been close to the organization in the fleet,' and he was one. That's all." Barton deemed it unwise to mention before Rich anything of what he had heard from Herringham about Rich's status in enemy circles. He had mentioned this to Mortimer in private, but the skill with which Rich had parried all attacks thus far and the staunch support of Admiral Bishop seemed to have obscured that testimony in Mortimer's mind, and the upshot of it was that he seemed perplexed and rather inclined to lean toward Rich's side of the case. Barton therefore left the room and, when out of sight of the others, beckoned Mortimer to follow. In a moment Mortimer excused himself and joined Barton in a corridor where they could be far enough to be safe from eavesdroppers while they conversed in whispers. Barton then reminded him of the testimony received in the secret messages from Herringham in Constantinople. Mortimer thought a moment and then remarked, "This might all have come from some spy who has caught on to Evans' method of getting messages from Gibraltar and has smuggled in fake messages implicating Rich." "That is extremely improbable," said Barton. "Anyway, there are so many things all pointing the same way I am convinced of his guilt." "He has offered a reasonable explanation of every item thus far," said Mortimer. "I don't see how we can prove the case against him without something more definite and unanswerable than we've got." While this whispered conference was going on in the corridor, Commander Rich and Admiral Bishop were making things as uncomfortable as they were able for Evans. The Admiral was so incensed by the affair that he freely proclaimed his indignation. Men who made such accusations against one of Rich's integrity and distinguished service ought to be imprisoned. Rich, with malicious insinuation, turned the odium of it upon Evans, who, glum and silent, paid no apparent heed. Mortimer and Barton, in the corridor outside, were making little progress with their conference, and were about to rejoin the others when Mortimer's attention was drawn to the sound of a man's voice talking rather excitedly to one of the clerks in the outer office. He listened and could hear the voice saying, "It is most important that I should see him at once." Then he heard the clerk say, "He is having a very important conference and can't be disturbed." Mortimer stepped into the outer office and saw that the man with the excited voice was Rand. "Did you wish to see me?" he asked. "Yes, at once," answered Rand breathlessly. Mortimer led him into the corridor. "What is it?" he said. "Tell me in a whisper. We can't go in there now." "Tompkins has just appeared," said Rand in a hoarse whisper. "He was kidnapped and has just escaped. His story is most important." "Where is he now?" "In his own office," said Rand. "Bring him here at once," said Mortimer. Rand disappeared on the run and in less than 3 minutes returned with Tompkins, looking thin, worn, and exhausted. Tompkins then told how on that memorable morning when so many things happened, he had gone early to the secretary's office with the message from Evans and, not finding Mortimer, had returned to his own office, and how, when he next set out, Commander Rich had dealt with the situation. "Commander Rich called you up and explained the situation, then handed me the phone," he said. "You probably remember the conversation. As I recall it, you said, 'It is all right, give Commander Rich the message. It will excite less notice if you don't keep coming to my office.'" "You say I said that?" broke in Mortimer. "Yes, sir." "I never had any telephone conversation with you at all that morning," said Mortimer, "nor with Rich till after I received the message delivered by his messenger." Tompkins stared with amazement. "This is the most important testimony we've got," said Barton. "Go on, and remember to speak quietly." Tompkins then told of his kidnapping, the long motor ride into the mountains, and the days of imprisonment in the abandoned logging hut with the scantiest food supplies under guard of 5 armed ruffians. A few days ago, they had an altercation. There were whispered conferences and arguments just out of my hearing. Angry words passed, and I don't know just what happened, but pretty soon I found that 3 of the 5 had deserted, leaving only the 2 to guard me. The food got low, and one of them had to walk a long distance to get more. He got back pretty tired. The 2 of them drank some liquor and started taking turns at watching through the night. Just before dawn, the man who had gone for the food, having stood watch since midnight, dropped off to sleep. The long walk and the liquor were too much for him. I was sleeping with one eye open. When I was satisfied that he was asleep, I slipped out of the hut. The dawn was just breaking, and I picked my way down a wood road and then ran until I had got a good mile from the hut. I tramped nearly all day, and in the afternoon reached a village where I learned that I was at the edge of the Shenandoah Mountains. I hadn't a cent, but I got a man to take me down in his flivver to a railroad town where I induced the bank president to trust me and give me a night's lodging. That was yesterday, but it seems like last year. This morning, he lent me the railroad fare to get back to Washington. I took the first train this morning and got in about an hour ago." Barton asked a few more questions and then said to Mortimer, "I think we'd better have him come right in and give his testimony before the others." Then he explained to Tompkins that Rich was charged with treason, and they were in the middle of the investigation. Mortimer and Barton re-entered the room, and then, with their eyes on Rich, beckoned Tompkins to follow. As Tompkins entered, Rich caught his breath with a gasp. There was no mistaking the pallor on his face now, nor did he regain his composure as easily this time. Tompkins then recited the details of the momentous morning when Rich had intercepted his message. Mortimer explained to Admirals Ralston and Bishop that he had never taken part in the alleged telephone conversation, that the message which Tompkins tried to deliver was identical with that which Evans had later repeated to Rand, and that the message received by messenger urging the recall of Fraser was a bogus one. Admiral Bishop was quite bewildered and got lost in the intricacies of the conflicting narratives. Ralston, grasping the significance of the revelations, looked very serious. Evans, alert and missing nothing, was looking more cheerful. Mortimer turned on Rich. "How do you explain this telephone conversation in which I never took part, but in which Mr. Tompkins understood me to instruct him to deliver his message to you?" Rich, once more perfectly at ease, replied, "I explain it by telling you it is a lie. Just one more bit of this whole elaborate frame-up. I told you Tompkins was probably involved in this business and had probably absconded." "Or committed suicide," put in Barton. Rich ignored the interruption and continued. "When he heard that there was a conspiracy on foot to discredit me, he saw his chance to get in on the thing. He has doubtless been in conference with others in his gang, and they have decided that this story is the best way to play their game." There was a pause. Admiral Bishop stroked his whiskers and nodded approvingly. "I think that is a very reasonable explanation, Mr. Secretary," he said. Evans then spoke. "I think there is now a chance of putting this thing to the test of something better than words. Until Tompkins entered the room just now, I had no idea he was in Washington. I didn't know whether he was still alive. I have therefore had no possible chance of collusion with him since I got home from the Azores. Are you satisfied on that point?" "Perfectly," answered Mortimer. "I should now like to ask Tompkins if he felt sure that he recognized the voice in the telephone as yours," continued Evans. "Is that a fair question?" "It is," said Mortimer, turning to Tompkins and awaiting his reply. "The voice sounded exactly like the Secretary's. I had no doubt of it at the time," said Tompkins. "Now," said Evans, "according to Tompkins' story, Commander Rich went through the usual procedure of calling this room through the bureau switchboard. In due course, a voice, which Tompkins believed he recognized as yours, answered. You never received the call. If Tompkins' story is true, someone must have cut the wires from Commander Rich's room to the switchboard. Otherwise, the call would have gone through to this room. Furthermore, someone who could mimic your voice must have been at the other end of the cut wires. When Goss was charged with cutting in on Tompkins' line and impersonating Commander Rich, more than one man in the Bureau testified to having seen him with a portable phone in the vicinity of the wires leading to the switchboard on the morning when all this happened. He was also shown to be an expert mimic. It remains then to see if the wires from Commander Rich's phone to the switchboard have been cut. As for the possibility that they have been cut since then in order to corroborate the story, you will notice that Tompkins himself has not suggested that mode of corroboration, and you have granted that he has had no opportunity of suggesting it to me. Furthermore, if his story is true, the wires must have been cut and spliced together again a week ago when all this happened. But if, as Commander Rich suggests, he had made up his story as the result of a recent conference with his gang after hearing that he had a good chance to get in on the frame-up, then, if he has had the forethought to cut and splice the wires in order to back up his story, he must have done it within a few hours. Now, an experienced electrician could tell, on examining the splices, whether they were done within a few hours or as long as a week ago. In 15 minutes, we can find out whether those wires have been cut and approximately when. I think, Mr. Secretary, said Admiral Bishop, it would be a gratuitous insult to a distinguished officer to follow the inquiry further by looking for such evidence against him. I am satisfied the whole business is an audacious conspiracy to discredit Commander Rich. Don't you think that fair play to Mr. Tompkins requires that we should look at those wires before concluding that he is lying? Asked Mortimer. I do not see it, said the Admiral. I do, said Mortimer. The electrician who had installed the wires in the Bureau at the outbreak of the war was sent for, also 2 other expert wiremen as witnesses. It was a strangely assorted procession that walked through the corridors of the Navy Department from the Secretary's room to the Bureau of Engineering. Secretary Mortimer and Admiral Ralston went first. Behind them followed Admiral Bishop and Commander Rich, while Barton, Evans, Rand, Tompkins, and Long brought up the rear. Evans and the electricians set to work removing planks to explore the wires leading from Commander Rich's room to the switchboard. It was not long before Evans, who had chosen a place where a man could work unseen to begin his search, called the others to come and look. There were the wires, each with a swelling of electric tape. This was carefully removed by one of the electricians, and under the tape the wires were spliced. Everyone had a look at the splices. Do you recall whether the wires were spliced at that point when you put them in? Asked Mortimer. I am certain that they were not, replied the electrician. Have you ever looked at them since? I inspected them 2 months ago. Were they spliced then? No. Could you swear to it? Yes. Can you tell how long ago those splices were made? The electrician examined the wires carefully, then answered, They weren't done within the last 3 days, I'm sure of that. How much longer ago? I can't tell. The other electricians examined the wires and all testified that the splices couldn't have been made less than 4 days ago at the very latest. The electricians were dismissed. Admiral Ralston turned to Admiral Bishop. Can you tell me how that evidence could have been faked? He said. Admiral Bishop did not answer. All eyes were now on Rich, who was an ashy gray. All his affable manner gone, a venomous look of malice on his face. Evans and Barton exchanged glances, and Barton nudged Admiral Ralston. Have you heard anything from our friend Bella since his unceremonious departure? Said Evans casually to Rich. He has been praising you warmly. Rich started violently and turned a shade paler. The look of fear and hate in his face was more intense than ever. He opened his mouth to speak, and then, Looking at the eyes of the others, all grimly watching him, he remained silent. Suddenly, he turned on Evans and like a flash drew a pistol from his pocket. Barton, standing close beside him, was watching him like a lynx. Quick as was Rich's hand, Barton's was quicker. With a swift blow, he struck Rich's right hand toward the ceiling with such force that the pistol flew from it and, sailing through the air, fell at Evans's feet. Long's desire to assault Rich now became uncontrollable. Like a wild animal, he sprang at him and dealt him a blow with his fist that sent him sprawling on the floor. High officials in Constantinople sent out message after message through secret channels, but the messages remained unanswered. The day after Rich suddenly ceased to be an officer in the United States Navy, a great seaplane arrived at Trepassey Bay from Halifax just after sunset. Out of it stepped Commander Barton and Radio Gunner Evans, both looking haggard and exhausted. They turned in early at the seaplane base. Next morning, before sunrise, they were once more on board the same seaplane that had brought them from the Azores, with the same skeptic as pilot, somewhat cheered now by his visit to dry land. At the floating hangar, they found the original crew of the plane, well rested now and eager to get back to the Azores. The sunset colors were fading, and the pink stucco buildings of Punta Delgada but dimly showing against the green hills behind the town as the great seaplane hovered over the battleship Delaware, answering her recognition signals, and then alighted at the entrance to the inner harbor. Evans was now easier in his mind, for Rich was no more. But still, he was terribly haunted by the fear that Rich or his agents had learned the secret of the code stolen by Wellman, alias Bella, and revealed it to their superiors in Constantinople. Therefore, the first thing he did on his arrival aboard the Delaware was to send one of his secret messages to Herringham by way of Kendrick, requesting an investigation as to whether the code was still believed to be genuine, and a report as soon as feasible. 2 days later, Evans, listening on his specially prepared receiver at the appointed hour when Kendrick was wont to transmit intelligence from Gibraltar, recognized the significant combination of sounds which meant there was news for him. Listening eagerly, with quickening pulse, he followed the message which came from Herringham. Careful investigation, it said, had satisfied him that implicit trust was still placed in the genuineness of the stolen code. Evans breathed freely once more. The talisman was still good. At last, early in April, orders were issued to the various units of the fleet to be ready for sea on a certain night, and a handful of men knew that this foreshadowed more than a practice cruise. This handful of men knew that, by dawn of the morning following the designated night, the entire fleet would be on the open sea. 2 days of feverish preparation followed, during which Evans made hasty visits in the role of family doctor, or rather chief consultant, to the radio apparatus of the fleet, diagnosing ailments, giving advice, and, when necessary, applying radical treatment to disordered gear. As the last day before the departure grew to a close, weary with his labors, but satisfied that the fleet was ready for its task, he went to the Borgia Garden at dusk and ascended the old watchtower once more. The moon was rising over the sea, and its broad, shimmering wake on the water was broken in 100 places by the dark forms of great ships, emblems of concentrated might. The moon rose higher till its outline was broken by the branches of the old cedar tree which formed a perfect frame for the great tableau of gallant ships on the shining water. Evans sat and drank in the glory of the picture before him, which for sheer beauty was almost unsurpassed in all his experience. Its splendor took his breath away, and as he sat gazing far off over the moonlit sea, with the soft air of the spring night fanning his cheek, a sense of the glamour of the great navy with its power and majesty swept over him. A wild thrill went through him, and long-forgotten feelings of his boyhood seized him. He yearned passionately to do great deeds and play an heroic part in this war for civilization. And as the expansive feeling took hold of him, he contemplated his own role as he saw it, a technical man fussing over small details in a small part of the great machine that was going forth to fight. A tiny cog in the works of a vast organization of men, almost a non-combatant compared with the men who would direct the battle or the spotters in the fighting top. With a pang he told himself that perhaps his part in the war was already done, and the yearning to express the heroic impulse within him must die unfulfilled. Then he rebuked himself for thinking of his own paltry role as if it were of consequence. The sublimity of the scene before his eyes inspired him to a larger perspective in which self was submerged and the cause was all. If the cause only triumphs, he thought, that's all that matters, and the cause will triumph. The majestic fleet, dotting the silvery surface of the moonlit sea, now seemed to him the symbol of a great hope, and yet, symbol though it was something very personal and very dear to him. Then there came back to him another feeling, long buried deep in the remote past, a feeling once closely linked with the ardent yearning for great deeds that had fired his youth. There rose before his eyes the vision of one who long ago had meant more to him than life itself, one who, when his hopes seemed brightest, had been snatched from him through the influence of a dominating and ambitious mother. From this, his thoughts turned to the memory of his own mother, unfailing in her sympathy, gone now, leaving him the priceless heritage of her devotion. It was time to return to the flagship. Descending through the shadowy paths of the old garden, he came out at last and threaded his way through the picturesque streets of the town to the harbor front, where the old-world architecture around the landing seemed shrouded in mystery in the pale moonlight. And as he took his place in the motor sailor, he felt that his spirit had been far away from the little things that make up the daily life in the fleet, now crowding in on his consciousness and dragging him rudely back from Olympian heights. By dawn the next morning, the vast fleet, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and all, had vanished. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Radio Gunner by Alexander Forbes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Battle. At communication headquarters of the enemy in Gibraltar, there were busy times. Radio experts, decoding experts, and intelligence officers were especially active in analyzing Allied naval dispatches. The code system to which Bella procured the key had been verified by repeated observation of fleet maneuvers, thus completing their assurance that the Allies still placed confidence in it and were changing code from month to month according to the schedule outlined in the key. And now activity of special interest was discovered. A considerable detachment of the Allied Navy, scouts, and armored cruisers, together with 4 of the older battleships, was cruising to the eastward of the Azores and approaching near enough to the coast of Portugal to make things look very interesting. Intercepted messages and radio compass bearings taken on their signals by the shore stations at Vigo, Lisbon, and Gibraltar told the story, leaving no chance of mistake as to the actual approach of the ships to the coast. Such a force as this, if cut off from the rest of the Allied fleet, would be easy prey for the Mediterranean Navy, and a chance to destroy it would be a golden opportunity, for the loss of these cruisers and battleships, even though the latter were nearly obsolete and inferior to the first-line capital ships, would be a serious blow to the Allies. It would measurably weaken their navy and greatly improve the outlook for a subsequent battle between the two fleets. But could this force be really cruising so far away from the main fleet as to render it liable to be cut off from support? With redoubled vigilance, the radio forces in the Portuguese and Spanish stations listened for clues to the presence of a supporting force of capital ships, or to some explanation of the apparently isolated position of the cruiser force. Now, in radio communications, as elsewhere, the chain is often no stronger than its weakest link. A slip on the part of a single operator entrusted with a message may work vast havoc through the resulting confusion. Before long, as the messages of the Allied flagships were decoded and studied by the enemy experts in Gibraltar, an explanation of the dangerous move of the Allied cruisers came to light. This force, conducting a sweep of the waters east of the Azores on the chance of finding enemy commerce raiders, was supposed to be remaining within reach of the main fleet, still at the Azores. That is, so near that if the enemy should put out from Gibraltar, the cruiser force and the rest of the fleet could, by steaming toward each other at full speed, effect a junction before the enemy battle cruisers, with their higher speed, could overtake and attack. But a message from Allied headquarters in Punta Delgada saying, "Proceed no further to the eastward," had through error been transmitted, "Proceed further to the eastward." Before the mistake had been discovered, the cruisers had steamed close into the vicinity of Cape St. Vincent and Gibraltar, and now, with the slow speed of the older battleships to retard their escape, and with the rest of the fleet far away, the detached force was in a most perilous position. All this was now revealed to the enemy through their analysis of intercepted messages. Clearly, there was no time to lose in giving chase. The cruiser force had discovered the mistake and would retreat toward the supporting fleet with all possible speed. But so near was it, and so much would its speed be retarded by the slower ships, that the battle cruisers of the Mediterranean Navy could surely overtake it before reinforcements could arrive on the scene. Emergency orders were given by the Turkish admiral. Steam was raised for maximum speed in the entire fleet, and with expedition denoting a high degree of preparedness and efficiency, the fleet steamed off to the westward in search of the detached force. Speed was everything in this pursuit, and soon the advance force of the battle cruisers, with a screen of scouts and destroyers thrown out ahead, speeding west at 29 knots, had dropped the main battle fleet out of sight astern. It was nearly sunset when the fleet left Gibraltar, and through the night the race to the westward went on. No radio signals were sent by the advance force, for, though their strength left no doubts in the mind of the commanding officer of his ability to destroy the force that now seemed almost within his grasp, still it was desirable to avoid revealing his approach in order that he might catch his prey unawares. He would probably make quicker work of them this way. But every radio operator listened intently for signals from the Allied cruisers. Before the night was over, they had been heard reporting progress and telling their whereabouts to the Allied battle fleet, supposedly hastening eastward in a vain endeavor to come to the rescue before a superior force from Gibraltar should have time to overtake and destroy them. To the great satisfaction of the Turkish admiral on the battle cruiser flagship, a message soon reached him from Gibraltar reporting that bearings taken by radio compass at Lisbon and Gibraltar on the same message of the Allied cruiser force had verified the position reported by the cruisers themselves, and showed that they were only making 19 knots. Soon after sunrise, the fugitives would be overtaken, and it would not be long before the heavy guns of the battle cruisers had sunk the entire force. Even if the Allied battle fleet had started eastward at top speed as soon as the dangerous position of the cruisers was discovered, they could not possibly reach the point where the battle cruisers would overtake the fugitive detachment before the afternoon. By that time, the battle cruisers would have ample time to finish off their victims, retreat, and effect a conjunction with their own battle fleet. The Mediterranean fleet, thus consolidated, could well afford, if conditions then seemed favorable, to meet and give battle to the Allied fleet, weakened as it would be by the loss of its cruisers and the 4 older battleships. At dawn, seaplanes were sent up from the Turkish battlecruiser squadron to scout to the westward and look for the Allied cruiser force, and especially to make sure that no other force not mentioned in the dispatches was lurking in the neighborhood. A light southwest wind was blowing. Low-lying haze and clouds rendered observations from any great height impossible. This obliged the seaplanes to fly low, Just after sunrise, they returned and reported sighting a considerable force of cruisers and destroyers steaming west. Being under orders to avoid approaching enemy craft near enough to be seen, they had returned without getting close enough to make out just what type of cruisers they had seen, or whether the 4 battleships were with them, for the visibility to the westward was very poor. There was no mistake then, their prey was surely theirs. The news was acclaimed with joy on the flagship. The admiral rubbed his palms together and smiled grimly. He recalled the great deeds of the Turkish navies of the 15th century and gloried in the thought that the honor of adding a new page to their illustrious record would be his. Onward steamed the battle cruisers, all hands in high hopes of a swift and decisive action. At 7:30 in the morning, the lookouts in the Mediterranean Scouts, 3 miles in advance of the battle cruisers, reported ships to the westward. Action stations was sounded, and the scouting line rapidly maneuvered into battle formation. Overtaking as fast as they were, it was soon easy to make out a long line of scout cruisers to the westward, now steaming on a northwesterly course. But where were the armored cruisers, and where were the 4 battleships that had been holding them back? The visibility to the westward was low, and probably the scouts and destroyers, having greater speed, had held back to give warning if a pursuing force should come. Probably the rest of the force was a few miles ahead. At all events, the scouts were now in range, and the chance to do them damage was not to be lost. The battle cruisers opened fire with their big guns and had landed 2 salvos close to the fleeing scout cruisers when a smoke screen from the destroyers on their flank hid them from view. When next they were seen, through the smoke, they had increased speed and opened the range so that the battle cruisers' salvos were falling short. The northwesterly course of the fleeing ships was a considerable change from the westerly course of the pursuit through the night. Possibly the slower ships had turned southwest in hopes of escaping in the low visibility while the scouts decoyed the battle cruisers away to the northwest. Therefore, the seaplanes were sent up again to search the sea to the southwest and find the armored cruisers and battleships. After a prolonged search, they returned with a report that no ships were to be seen to the west, southwest, or south for a distance of many miles. Meanwhile, the destroyers of the 2 fleets had come together in an attempt to maneuver for torpedo attack against the larger ships. Lively shelling at close range resulted, but only minor damage was done on either side. In consequence of this diversion, the smoke screen became sufficiently dissipated to enable the battle cruisers to catch sight of the Allied scouts speeding toward the northwest far on the port bow, near the limit of visibility. Again they opened fire and saw their salvos beginning to fall very close just before the smoke screen of the destroyers again hid them from sight. When next they came into view, they had changed course to north and were already bearing almost dead ahead. The battle cruisers swung onto a parallel course and opened a heavy fire on them, but the rapidly changing range made the targets difficult to hit, so dodging salvos, the Allied scout cruisers sped northward, disappearing again into smoke and haze. Hitherto, the scout cruisers of the Mediterranean fleet had remained only a short distance ahead of their supporting battle cruisers and hence too far out of effective range of the Allied scouts to make it worthwhile to open fire with their 6-inch guns. But now a signal was made from the flagship telling the scouts to pursue and engage those of the Allies. Putting on all speed and changing course to port, the Mediterranean scouts succeeded in closing the range with their adversaries till it was possible to engage them with their 6-inch guns. And now, for the first time in the war, ships of the same type, evenly matched, engaged in battle. In numbers, speed, and gunpowder, there was little to choose between the opposing scout cruiser divisions, but in morale, the difference was one that told in the tense 5 minutes after the cruisers opened fire on each other. Those of the Allies replied to the first salvo, which fell short, not only with a salvo from their own 6-inch guns, but also by deploying sharply toward their adversaries, thus passing well under the second enemy salvo, which screeched overhead and rapidly closing the range. Hits were scored on both sides. On the Allied ships, one gun was put out of action, while several shells burst in pantries, hammock lashings, and other places, which caused more annoyance than vital damage. But so heavy and determined was their fire upon the Mediterranean scouts that, with flames bursting forth and magazines endangered, a conning tower smashed, skipper and all, and 2 or 3 guns crippled, confusion and panic began to spread. With the Allied fire growing heavier and their own growing wild, the Turks soon veered sharply away and retreated under cover of the big guns of the battle cruisers. What with distance, haze, and the smoke screen of the destroyers, only the flashes of the guns on the Allied scouts were visible to the pursuing battle cruisers, and when their firing ceased as the Mediterranean scouts withdrew, they disappeared from view altogether. But it was not for long. Soon they were seen again through a rift in the smoke screen, once more dead ahead, and now heading no longer north, but northeast. What could this mean? Could it be that these scouts were leading the battle cruisers into some sort of trap? Could there be reinforcements lying in wait to the northeast? This seemed hardly possible. No vessels had been heard sending radio signals in that vicinity, although the net of sensitive receivers capable of detecting even the feeblest signals had been constantly spread, an army of vigilant operators listening every instant for the faintest sound. Nothing had been heard save the steady stream of tactical signals between the Allied scout cruisers as they sped away. If the 4 old battleships and the armored cruisers reported to have been with the scouts had gone in that direction, it would be the worse for them, since the heavy guns of the approaching battle cruisers, soon to be reinforced by those of the main battle fleet coming up rapidly from the east, would make short work of them. No, it was unlikely that the Allied scouts would attempt to lead them toward the detached division of slower ships. The main battle fleet of the Allies must still be far away, in the vicinity of the Azores. The dispatches intercepted the day before seemed to make a certainty of that. This move on the part of the Allied scouts was quite unintelligible. At all events, it was leading them toward the main battle fleet of the Mediterranean powers. At this rate, a junction would soon be effected, and the Turks couldn't wish anything better than that. The chase continued on a northeasterly course till the forenoon was well advanced, the fugitive scouts and destroyers of the Allies appearing like shadows in a dream with bewildering elusiveness, and all this time the main battle fleet from the east, apprised of the course of events by radio from the battle cruisers, was approaching rapidly on a northwesterly course. Most of the time, the Allied scouts were out of sight and fire was withheld, but now and then a fleeting glimpse of them would cause the battle cruisers to loose off a salvo or 2. The lookouts on the pursuing ships did not see 2 American destroyers approach the Allied scouts from the north at 35 knots and fall into line on their port beam, but they did see the scouts reappear through the haze and smoke once again at closer range than before, having shifted course to the east. This was better still. The battle cruisers would sooner effect a junction with the main fleet. By noon, the men in the fighting tops of the Mediterranean battle cruisers saw the welcome sight of smoke in the southeast, denoting the approach of their main battle fleet. A few minutes later, the smoke was also seen by the lookouts on the Allied scouts. The Mediterranean fleet was now united in one colossal force. The scout and battle cruiser squadrons taking station ahead of the battleships. Upon this, the Allied scout cruisers and destroyers veered to the north, zigzagging, disappearing behind smoke screens and fitfully reappearing, these scouts presented a maddeningly difficult target for the battle cruisers. With the speed presumably at their disposal, they might have drawn away and escaped, but instead they zigzagged and kept reappearing so near that the battle cruisers would open fire on them, only to lose sight of them again in the smoke and haze before the rangefinders, spotters, and trainers could get in the necessary work for hitting the elusive targets. Then, as the order to cease firing was given, the commanders would realize to the tune of many an oath that they had only been wasting ammunition. Thus the running fight went on, the entire fleet of the Mediterranean powers pursuing a squadron of scout cruisers and a score or so of destroyers on a northerly course, but only the battle cruisers in the van could get within range of the fugitives. For half an hour they held this course. Then the zigzagging of the Allied scouts took them farther to the west, till by 1 o'clock the pursuit had shifted to a northwesterly course. Then, for a moment, the scout cruisers appeared still well in the lead, but more clearly visible than usual and offering an irresistible target for the big guns of the battle cruisers. But it was only for a brief minute or two, and as the salvos began to splash closer to their mark, 6 destroyers were seen to dash between the scouts and their pursuers, sending out a dense smoke screen behind which all else was lost to view. The smoke screen continued to lie like a great pall far on the port bow of the pursuing fleet, but the light southwest wind swept it toward their path, and soon the destroyers, dodging behind their own screen, had also vanished from sight. They must, however, still be holding the same general course, for the smoke continued to pour forth, making a wide blanket to the west and northwest, and behind that blanket the scouts were doubtless increasing speed to make good their escape. So said the Turkish admiral in command of the battle cruiser squadron, but he could not see the Allied scout cruisers behind their screen executing the same maneuver which the German high seas fleet executed at Jutland, although the British believed it impracticable in action for a simultaneous swing-around, whereby each ship doubled on her own tracks, and all at the same moment. Both the direction and the order of the ships were rapidly reversed, steaming back at high speed together with the majority of the destroyers, all but the 6 that made the screen. It was only a few minutes before the Allied scouts were abreast of the main body of the enemy's battle fleet, some miles astern of the battle cruisers. Again, the simultaneous swing-around was effected, and the scouts closed in on the enemy. With blank amazement, the Turkish commander-in-chief on the bridge of his flagship saw the long, slender scout cruisers, 9 in number, preceded by some 18 destroyers, emerge from the thinning smoke and haze barely 5 miles away on his port beam and come tearing at top speed toward his formidable fleet of giant dreadnoughts. The audacity of it fairly staggered him. Here they came into the very jaws of death. The smoke screen dissipated and blowing across his line left the visibility good toward the southwest. Against the bright horizon sky under the sun, the approaching ships stood out clearly, making excellent targets, but for their speed, which taxed the rangefinder's powers to the limit. Clearly, it was an attack with intent to torpedo. "What madness is this?" gasped the admiral. "They'll pay for their folly," he added grimly, and all along his battle line big guns and secondary batteries began to belch forth their terrific fire on the swarm of hornets making their reckless dash. And pay they did. One of the scouts was hit heavily by 2 successive salvos, burst into flames, and then blew up in a great cloud of black smoke. Another, with steam pouring from the rent deck over her engine room, veered off, dropped out of the line, and soon fell rapidly astern. But the other 7 came on at a frightful pace, following close to the destroyers, already hotly engaged by those of the enemy. On came the destroyers through the deadly hail of shot, and some of them came unscathed except for funnels and superstructures to within 6,000 yards of the great battle line, where each one let go a dozen torpedoes. The scout cruisers, close behind, fired their torpedoes almost at the same moment. So densely did these underwater missiles swarm toward the great battle fleet that, in spite of every effort to dodge, several vital hits were made. One battleship sank then and there. Another hit close to the stern, her port propeller gone, and her steering gear smashed, was soon left wallowing helpless far astern. The admiral in his flagship muttered savagely as he saw two of his best ships put out of action, but he noted with satisfaction the cruel punishment the Allied scout cruisers and destroyers were getting as they turned to retreat after firing their torpedoes. He was eagerly watching his salvos hit, the red glow of the impact, the bursts of flame, the shattered decks and superstructures that marked the havoc wrought by his gunners, when a frightful din behind him made him turn and stare wildly to starboard. There, scarce 100 yards away, rose the giant splash of a concentrated salvo of heavy shells. With an awful screech, projectiles ricocheted overhead, and tons of water came aboard. Only the big guns of a dreadnought could have sent such a salvo. Where was she? The skyline to starboard, all the way from north to east, was obscured by the combined smoke of the Allied destroyers and the entire Mediterranean fleet, blown thither by the southwest wind and merging into the haze. In vain the admiral and his lookouts searched for the outline of an enemy ship. But then, through the murk, they saw faintly an ominous ripple of orange flashes, extending almost continuously for miles along the northeastern horizon. Not one, but many salvos were on their way through space, coming with deadly aim for his battleships. With indescribable noise, the next salvo arrived and straddled the flagship. One shell hit fair on a forward turret, exploded, and put its 3 guns hopelessly out of action. Another started an angry blaze on the superstructure. Others tore great holes in the ship's side, wrecking compartments through which they passed. Looking anxiously down the line of ships astern, the admiral saw an awful picture of fires and explosions, telling of havoc already wrought. Confusion and consternation were everywhere. All hands on all ships had been giving their full attention to pouring the hottest kind of fire from full broadsides into the attacking destroyers and scouts as they endeavored to turn and escape from the close range to which they had approached. No one grasped the significance of this sudden development in time to begin training the turrets around to starboard before the second salvo arrived and registered damaging hits on nearly half the ships of the line. Orders were wildly shouted and signals made, and when they understood what was up, with all the speed they could muster, the distracted men trained the big turrets to starboard. But what was there to shoot at? Not a ship could be seen. Only the dim blur of the orange-red flashes through the smoke revealed where the salvos came from, and these were far too well obscured to enable the rangefinders to give the gunners the distance or to offer a target for trainers and pointers. But from a range of 12,000 yards, each of the Mediterranean battleships presented a perfect target in silhouette against the southwestern sky to the battle line of the Allied fleet. In the radio room of the battleship Delaware, Admiral Johnson's flagship, there had been a busy scene all morning. Yet in all the fleet, not a transmitter was in action. Not a signal was sent by radio, for a single spark might reveal their presence to the enemy and give away the maneuver. But on every battleship and on every destroyer, the radio operators were listening intently. nearly 100 miles to the northeast, as the running fight between the enemy battle cruisers and the scouts began in the early morning, the Allied battleship fleet, well screened by destroyers, had been maneuvering, guided by radio compass bearings taken on the tactical signals of the Allied scouts and the signals exchanged between the battle cruisers and the main fleet of the enemy. Since no telltale radio signals could be sent, all messages between the ships of the Allied battle fleet must be transmitted by flag hoist or by blinker. Flashes were sent by searchlights from the bridge. By this means, the radio compass reports from all parts of the fleet were silently relayed to the flagship, and in return, all orders directing operations were sent out from the flagship to the other ships without making a sound that could reveal their presence to the enemy. So important was it to place the ships accurately in the desired position that two methods besides those of ordinary navigation were used to coordinate the movements of the battle fleet with those of the decoying squadron of scout cruisers and destroyers. Radio compass triangulation was worked both ways. First, with the battle fleet as a baseline. Second, with the decoying scout cruisers as a baseline. The second method was a rough one, for in their running fight, the scouts offered a poor baseline at best. Therefore, the main reliance was placed on the baseline established in the main fleet. For this purpose, two groups of destroyers, one at each end of the column, were detailed to take radio compass bearings on the signals of the scout cruiser flagship and report them to the Delaware by blinker, the reports being relayed from ship to ship all along the column. This method was accurate but slow because of the time needed to relay the reports. Therefore, it was supplemented by the reverse process, the Delaware herself taking bearings on signals exchanged between the two ends of the scout cruiser column. The Delaware had two radio compasses at widely separate points on the superstructure in case of accident to one. At these stations were two men whom Evans had chosen from all the radio compass operators in the fleet for the speed and accuracy with which they could take bearings. At one of these stations, with an extra pair of headphones plugged into the circuit, Evans listened in during the entire time of the running fight which brought the fleets together, checking the bearings taken by the operator and reporting them to the plotting room. Thus, he gave Fraser a rough estimate of the position of the scouts sometime before the more accurate information could be relayed in from the destroyers. In the plotting room, Captain Fraser, Chief of Staff, with a group of officers plotting the entire development of the action, including the positions and progress of both the advance force and the main fleet of the enemy, and of the decoying scouts and the battle fleet of the Allies, received the advance reports which Evans gave him and prepared in his mind the next step in maneuvering the battle fleet while waiting for the corroborating reports from the destroyers at the ends of the column. Thus the morning wore on. The mighty fleet, giant dreadnoughts, armored cruisers, scouts, and destroyers spread out for miles over the wide expanse of ocean, all moving in perfect unison, maneuvered at the behest of Fraser's guiding mind. Now they would speed up, now slow down, now change course to port or starboard, much as a hawk with a watchful eye will hover and wheel before the final swoop on his prey. And ever the suspense grew more acute. Admiral Johnson on the bridge scanned the wide horizon where his great line of ships stretched away as far as the eye could reach, and farther. Signalmen, tense and alert, awaited the word to flash out orders by blinker or bend on the flags to the signal halyards. Lookouts way aloft strained their eyes to detect the slightest object on the blue expanse of sea. In the middle of the morning, Fraser, studying on the plotting sheet the converging courses of the three groups of ships, calculated where his decoying force of scout cruisers should next lead the enemy in order to place them in a favorable position for attack. He then dispatched the 2 destroyers which approached the scout cruiser squadron from the north, where the enemy could not see them, with orders for them to shift course from northeast to east. Soon after this, signals were sent out from the Delaware to the rear admirals in command of the various battleship divisions, giving them preparatory instructions for the maneuver which should bring the fleet into battle line when the right moment arrived, and apprising them of the imminence of battle. By this time every man in the fleet knew that momentous doings were on foot, but few knew what the next turn of events would be. The ships were cleared for action. As soon as the radio reports from the scouts showed that the enemy had joined forces, a 3rd destroyer was sent to approach the scouts under cover of the smoke and haze in the northwest, telling them what course to steer and when to make the torpedo attack which should divert and absorb the attention of the enemy. The united fleet of the enemy was now only 15 miles away, bearing southeast. The booming of their heavy guns was clearly heard. On every ship, all hands were assembled and told that action of the first magnitude was at hand. The situation was outlined, conditions were favorable, and the outcome was in their hands. On the Delaware, Admiral Johnson spoke to the men himself. "The great battle is at hand," he said. "Now is the chance of your lives to show what is in you. The outcome of the war is at stake. The advantage of visibility will all be on our side. You will see the enemy better than he can see you. It is a golden chance to do your best at gunnery. So keep your heads and shoot straight, and your first 5 minutes shooting will decide the issue. We are going to make it a swift and decisive victory, and it depends on you. In a few minutes' time, a detachment of our scouts and destroyers will make a desperate attack on the enemy's battle line from the farther side, partly to damage him with torpedoes, but chiefly to draw his fire from us. We are asking heroism of the highest order from them. Let us see that it is not given in vain." Then general quarters was sounded. The men ran eagerly to their action stations. Now began a maneuver of the fleet which would have staggered the imagination of an admiral of the Jutland days. A brief series of signals went out from the Delaware, and at the word, the countless ships of the fleet commenced an evolution so bewildering and involved that the keenest observer would have seen in it nothing but disorder and confusion. In complexity, it surpassed the performance of the most intricate machine. Yet, in an incredibly short time, all ships fell as if by magic into battle line in perfect formation, on a northwesterly course that slowly converged on the enemy. As soon as the scouts commenced their simultaneous swing around, they ceased sending signals, lest they betray their move. But the destroyers, making the smoke screen where they had been, kept up the pattern needed to inform the battle fleet of their progress. As soon as the scouts emerged from the lifting smoke screen and came into full view of the enemy battle line in their final dash, they began again to use their radio. The battle fleet of the Allies had now maneuvered into a position northeast of the enemy, broad on his starboard bow, and had swung into battle formation. The lookouts reported sighting the enemy battleships, and Fraser, now in the conning tower, noted with satisfaction how closely their position agreed with that deduced from the great mass of data which had been pouring into the plotting room. The radio compass had not failed. The maneuver, which had been his dream since he scratched the diagram on the ground in the Borgia garden, was realized at last. It had worked even better than he had hoped. Then, in the radio room, the signals of the scouts were again heard. "Attacking enemy on his port beam, range 9,000 yards, under heavy fire, big guns and secondary battery, range 8,000 yards, and so on. Thanks to the greater visibility to the southwest, the enemy battle line was now clearly in view from the turrets and control tops. The rangefinders had measured the range, the targets had been assigned, the trainers and pointers were on, and all were in readiness to open fire. Their suspense was nearing the breaking point. Then the results of the torpedo attack appeared. One battleship's silhouette changed to a cloud of black smoke and vanished. The other disabled ship could be seen to drop out of line. At a signal from the Delaware, all at once the broadsides of the entire battle line went off. In record time, the second salvo followed the first, and then the third, and even before the enemy had responded and his first salvos had come screeching through the air, great fires and jets of steam and smoke told the story of heavy damage already done across the 6 miles of water. There was now no more need for silence. The flagship would direct the movements of the fleet by radio. All transmitters would be in action. The radio compass had done its work. Evans left the radio compass station and hastened to a hatch leading to the main radio room beneath the armored deck. As he crossed the superstructure, he saw far away in the southwest the scene of wild tumult. Ships on fire, the orange flashes of their salvos, the splashes and hits of the straddling salvos from the Allied fleet, and then the great splashes of the enemy's salvos landing several hundred yards short, followed by the screech of their ricocheting shells overhead. Added to this, the deafening roar of the Delaware's own broadside completed an indelible picture in his mind as he went below into the comparative quiet of the radio room, now becoming the busy scene of tactical dispatches coming and going, with Elkins directing the work of coding and decoding. The scouts and destroyers of the decoying force had paid a fearful price in the climax of their torpedo attack. The 7 surviving cruisers, all riddled with shells, some crippled with vital hits, their decks strewn with splinters and wreckage, but all still able to steam, withdrew out of range. Their work was done, and well done. Several destroyers were sunk, for they had come even closer to the enemy and thus drawn the heavier fire. Those nearest to their sinking comrades turned, zigzagged, dodged a salvo or two, and then stopped while the shells still fell round them thick and fast to rescue the survivors, the speed of the enemy battle fleet soon, happily, causing the range to increase just enough to render the rescue something short of downright suicide. Yet many men went down with their ships, thinking to the last, not of self, but only of the fight. Barely had the attacking cruisers and destroyers on the port side of the Mediterranean column withdrawn when no less than 40 American destroyers appeared darting out from the haze on their starboard bow. With all available destroyers of the Mediterranean fleet busy repelling the first attack on the port side, and with all turret guns not yet crippled, firing wildly into the haze on the northeastern horizon, there was nothing left but the starboard secondary batteries of the battleships with which to repel this new and formidable onslaught. The morale of the gunners, already shaken by the startling turn of events, was no whit the better for the sight of the angry swarm of destroyers charging in with the speed of express trains. Their fire was hot but wild, and soon the sea fairly seethed with torpedo tracks, which the battleships desperately maneuvered to dodge, thus dislocating the aim of their turrets. The torpedo attack was chiefly concentrated on the leading ships and especially on the Mediterranean flagship, for well the Allies knew that morale was not the Turks' long suit and that the loss of centralized control would severely cripple his fleet. In spite of frantic efforts by the gunners of the secondary battery and vigilant watch for torpedo tracks from the bridge and crow's nest, nothing the helmsman could do availed to dodge the concentrated swarm of torpedoes, and in less than 10 minutes from the landing of the first salvo, the Mediterranean flagship was hit in the starboard engine room. The men on the American destroyers, now zigzagging off through a tornado of shellfire, looked back through the leaping pillars of white frothy water and shouted as they saw the great battleship more than half obscured by a strange patchwork of white steam and black smoke rising in clouds above her fighting tops. Then they saw her, with her engines crippled, listing heavily to starboard, fall out of line and drop astern. The Turkish admiral signaled a light cruiser to come alongside and soon had transferred his flag to another battleship farther astern, swinging well out of line to port and thus taking refuge on the disengaged side of his line during the transfer. Before his flagship was torpedoed, the admiral had managed to send a signal to his advance battle cruiser force, ordering them to deploy to starboard and attack the Allied battle line. The rear admiral in charge of this force, angry at his vain pursuit of scout cruisers which had led him into the trap, turned his flagship at high speed and led his column impetuously to the attack. At 9,000 yards, in spite of the low visibility to the east, he sighted the American flagship leading the Allied column and, swinging rapidly onto a parallel course, opened fire on her. The Delaware, having seen the enemy flagship hit by the torpedo and then fall out of line, was in the act of training her turrets on the next battleship astern when the enemy battlecruisers suddenly appeared, closing rapidly on her port bow. She had barely time to train her turrets on the leading battlecruiser before the concentrated fire of 3 of these formidable opponents began to pour in upon her. And now came the great test for her manifold radio equipment. There was no time to lose. Signals must be sent to all battleships within range to support her by diverting their fire to these fast and powerful ships. Signals must be sent to all available destroyers to harass them with torpedo attacks. And still, the direction of the fleet as a unit must go on, and all without mutual interference of messages. Signals were flashing out simultaneously on different wavelengths from 3 or 4 separate antennae, both by radio telephone and by radio telegraph. The Delaware was now heavily engaged, delivering salvos from her turrets at the maximum speed and, in spite of zigzagging, frequently being straddled by the salvos of the battle cruisers. Down in the radio room, officers were feverishly coding and decoding messages. Some operators were sending them, others tending the control switches whereby the radio telephone was kept running so that the chief of staff in the conning tower could give orders verbally to those units which he was in the greatest hurry to reach. Evans was watching the various ammeters and indicators to see that the machinery ran smoothly, and Elkins was directing the whole show. Suddenly, Evans noticed the meters of the radio telephone outfit doing strange things. Down behind the battleship's armor, the general din of action was so confused that the burst of a shell on the superstructure had not been noticed as distinct from the rest. But to Evans, the combination of symptoms in the meters told a story. "The antenna or rat tail of the phone set is broken," he shouted to Elkins. "Tell Fraser, I'll see if it can be fixed." Then, turning to the chief radio electrician and pointing to the generator involved, he called, "Shut off the juice and don't turn it on till I tell you." Then, seizing a spool of wire and a strong pair of wire-cutting pliers, he shot out of the room. A hasty conversation then followed by voice tube between Elkins and Captain Fraser in the conning tower, in which arrangement was made for the use of the next most expeditious channel of communication with the destroyer flotilla. Just then Fraser, looking out of the conning tower, saw a figure in dungarees climbing rapidly up the basket mast like a monkey with a loose wire trailing from his belt. Evans, coming on deck, had found the rat tail, cut away from the antenna by a shell fragment, sprawling on the deck. Seizing the broken end and securing it to his belt, he started up the ladder, swinging himself out on the framework where necessary to avoid leading the rat tail foul of stays. As he crawled out at last, clinging like a bee to the chain of insulators that supported the antenna, swaying in midair and groping for the ends of the broken wires that had converged from the antenna to the rat tail, his senses were fairly dazed by the roar and din of the battle now raging at its height. Shells screeched past him. Shells hit on the decks, shaking the whole ship as they burst. Great fountains of water rose where others fell short and filled the air with heavy spray. Smoke was pouring from a large, jagged hole in the deck, and as he clung there, swaying high in the air, he saw a large whaleboat smashed to matchwood by a shell, fragments of her timbers flung far into the sea. A fire brigade was running aft over the splintered deck, the men looking like ants from the great height whence he caught these fragmentary glimpses of the scene. Every 15 seconds, consciousness seemed suspended as the Delaware's 12 16-inch guns let go their salvos. Flash, roar, and concussion fusing in one mighty shock that well-nigh stunned and paralyzed every faculty. Half-dazed, he could only cling each time till the salvo was over, then renew his efforts to reach the swaying wires, and each time the spotters in the foretop close by, while waiting for the smoke to clear and the seconds to elapse before the salvo was due to reach its mark, looked round to see if he was still there. At last he reached the wires and, clinging with both legs and one arm, managed to join together the broken ends by means of the spool of wire in his pocket. As he crawled back, he had a momentary glimpse of the enemy battlecruisers in the west and could clearly distinguish from the flash of their gunfire the red glow of the hits made by the Delaware's salvos. The action, as he had seen it earlier when he was on his way to the radio room, was mild compared to what was going on now. The Delaware was being heavily pounded, but, supported by the 3 battleships next in line, she was scoring more hits on the enemy than she received, and with heavier shells. Just as he reached the basket mast, there was a concussion which almost shook him off. Looking aft, he saw fragments of steel flying from the roof of one of the turrets. With a sinking feeling, he realized that in that turret was Lindsay's battle station. A moment later, some of the turret crew came scrambling out of the hole the shell had torn. Then, to his horror, he saw a great burst of flame shoot from the turret and rise to the height of the mast. Descending the basket mast, he shouted to Captain Fraser as he passed the conning tower, "All ready to use," and hastened below to the radio room, where he found the generator already humming again at its task of supplying the power to carry the voice from the conning tower far over the turbulent waters. And as he watched the meters on the panel, he knew that the transmitter was again carrying the messages that were directing the work of the fleet. But his heart was sick with the haunting picture of the flame shooting from Lindsay's turret. A flotilla of American destroyers stationed ahead of the column was now racing to attack the battle cruisers with torpedoes. Simultaneously, some 30 more destroyers, all that were left and able to fight of the 40 which had just delivered their attack on the enemy's main battle line, came up from the south to join in this new attack. Meanwhile, the destroyers of the enemy, thrown into confusion by the unexpected change in affairs, their coordination completely upset when the flagship of the fleet was put out of action, operated in haphazard fashion, each virtually on its own, darting about like mad hornets in search of their tormentor. Some of them now came to the support of the battle cruisers and engaged in lively dueling with the American destroyers at close range, but their haphazard attacks availed little against the teamwork by which the Allied flotillas delivered their concentrated torpedo attack. The Allied fleet had a great advantage in visibility all along the line. Not only the main battle fleet of the enemy in the southwest, but also his battle cruisers in the west stood out in bold relief against the afternoon sky. For this reason, as well as by virtue of the heavier guns of the Allied battleships and the disconcerting effect of the torpedo attack, the fire of the battle cruisers soon became wild and ineffective. Vital hits were being made on them in increasing numbers, and soon one of them, on fire in several places, was straddled by a salvo, which let the flames into her magazine. With a blaze that lit the sky, she burst into fragments, leaving nothing but oil and wreckage when the smoke cleared. Another, hit in a starboard boiler room, was unable to maintain speed and, to avoid being pounded to pieces as she dropped astern past the entire battle line of the Allies, turned sharply to port and escaped behind her own line of battleships. The remainder of the battle cruisers, battered and crippled, drew out of range while they still could, pursued by destroyers racing after like a pack of hungry greyhounds. Now the Delaware and those directly astern of her were able to concentrate their fire once more on the main battle line of the enemy, or what was left of it. One turret on the Delaware was out of action. Her funnels and superstructure were riddled with shells. Her decks presented a picture of chaos, but in the main her fighting strength was scarcely impaired. The Allied battle line had maintained a range which rendered them invisible except for the flash of their guns in the northeastern haze and smoke, while the enemy in silhouette against the southwestern horizon made good targets for the American gun layers. And during the time when the leading ships were compelled to direct their fire on the enemy battlecruisers, those in the rear had been pounding away at their corresponding ships in the enemy's line, scoring 2 hits at least to 1 received, till, with turrets smashed, control tops gone, bridges shattered, and superstructures ablaze, the hostile guns were silenced in steadily increasing numbers. Now, seeing that he had the enemy where he wanted him, Admiral Johnson closed the range enough to render his gunfire even more effective. This brought his ships into view of the enemy, whose gunfire was so badly broken that he no longer feared it. Then, as with increasing deadliness of aim the 16-inch guns tore holes in deck and armor, the shattering of the Mediterranean fleet became more rapid. And as ship after ship sank, or out of control and helpless, dropped out of line, the concentration of fire upon those that remained closed in like a nemesis. 2 hours after the first salvo from the Allied battleships, the great Mediterranean fleet, which had defied the civilized world, was reduced to a straggling line of battered hulks scattered over the sea in all stages of destruction. Before sunset, the Turkish admiral had surrendered. The casualties of the Allies had been surprisingly light, considering the extent of the action, having fallen most heavily on the scout cruisers and destroyers, although the battleships had come in for a good share of pounding, in spite of their advantage in the matter of visibility. On the Delaware, the most serious mishap had been in the turret from which the ominous flame had shot forth. The members of the turret crew who had escaped told the story of what happened. A shell had penetrated the roof of the turret and killed several of the crew. Their clothing, ignited by the detonating shell, was spreading fire toward a charge of powder in the loading cage on its way to one of the guns. Lindsay, in command of the turret, seeing that nothing could avert the explosion and shouting, "Clear the turret," to those around him, had plunged down through the working chamber into the main trunk and yelled into the handling room below the order to close the magazine doors. Instantly, the doors had slammed shut, thus cutting off the magazine from the turret. In another second, the fire reached the powder, filling the entire turret, handling room, and all with a blinding flash, which instantly killed all those who had not yet made their escape. Lindsay's quick action, which cut off his hope of escape, had saved the flagship. End of Chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Radio Gunner by Alexander Forbes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Harbor at Sunset. It was an impressive procession of ships that steamed into Punta Delgada 2 days after the great battle. As the Delaware at the head of the column, battle-scarred from stem to stern, passed the supply ships and fleet tenders anchored in the roadstead, the shout that went up seemed as if it would lift the vault of heaven. For miles astern, the battleships stretched out in an apparently endless line, while the destroyers and cruisers lined both flanks. The disabled craft, including the surrendered ships of the enemy, followed more slowly at a greater distance, while those unable to steam were still waiting near the scene of the action for ocean-going tugs to arrive and tow them in. In the United States, not a hint of an impending naval crisis had filtered through into the daily press. So, when the news of the victory came, the people were fairly dazed by it. Stirring as it was, and great as was the rejoicing throughout the land, the full meaning of it was scarcely realized at first, for the extent to which the enemy depended on his fleet was not understood by the general public. But the heads of the coalition government in Constantinople understood, and cursed their lot, and trembled in their shoes. And the British Admiralty understood, and lost no time instigating the Foreign Office in London to make certain significant representations to Washington, which figured largely in the negotiations that followed. Before long, overtures from Constantinople concerning peace were received in Washington and London. They were met by a firm and solid front on the part of the Allies. Nothing but unconditional surrender would be acceptable. The Constantinople leaders, being better endowed with wits than with morale, had little disposition to prolong a futile struggle or continue a losing game, especially as they held the Mediterranean powers united by a slender thread of intrigue rather than by unity of spirit. Their control of the sea irrevocably lost to them, their armies were doomed to ultimate defeat. Therefore, after some clever attempts at bargaining for terms which were coolly and flatly rejected by the Allies, they agreed to unconditional surrender. With explosive force, the news spread through the Western world like a titanic peal of thunder echoing from mountain crest to valley and reverberating throughout the land. The bells rang, and all the populace gave themselves to wild joy or solemn thanksgiving. As soon as the surrender had been made, the Allied fleet proceeded to Gibraltar to take possession. At the first opportunity for shore liberty, Evans found Hedrick, and for hours they talked over the events since they had separated in the dark on the shore at Punta Delgada. The tales which Hedrick told of his adventures in finding his way to the desired post at a radio transmitter fairly made Evans's blood run cold. A kaleidoscopic sequence of hardships, narrow escapes, and undreamed-of expedients to outwit the enemy, long hours in hiding, disguises, brazen effrontery, and lightning decisions in the face of danger, all told with the unconcern of one used to living in that sort of thing, kept Evans enthralled, now laughing, now as nervous as if himself facing the danger of discovery. Before leaving, Evans arranged to have the kayak exhumed from her hiding place and sent back to her owner. June was in its prime when Evans, on his release from active duty, returned to his home, a private citizen. He went to the university where, before the war, he had been engaged in research and asked if he might resume his former position as associate in physics and continue the researches which had been interrupted. Some there were in the university who looked askance at the giving of valuable laboratory space to one who had held no more distinguished a position in the war than radio gunner. But there stood his unique apparatus, which had taken him years of patient labor to assemble, and which no one in the world but he could use. Fortunately, the head of the physics department understood this, and his wish prevailed. Evans, assured that his cherished laboratory was his, once more returned to it. The apparatus stood as he had left it, but covered with the dust of 2 long years. A flood of happy memories returned to him, of days and nights spent in enthralling quests. He began eagerly to overhaul and test the apparatus in preparation for the renewed attack on the great problems which awaited his long-deferred experiments for their solution. For a few days he tinkered with the intricate assortment of instruments and devices, inspecting parts here, making minor repairs on them there, looking over old notes and endeavoring to plan his campaign for renewed research. But as the hot July days wore on, his brain seemed to balk at the task. He realized that he was tired with the deep-seated fatigue which a day's rest or a week's rest will not cure. On the one hand, the din of a great naval action still echoed in his ears. On the other, he heard the call of the sea and the wild New England shore. "I'll make a better job of this in September," he said to himself, and, closing his laboratory for the summer, he went to New Bedford, where soon he was splicing ropes and helping the riggers at the shipyard put the Petrel in commission. In a few days he was again at the wheel of his beloved boat, the sails pulling hard in the fresh southwest wind. Leaving New Bedford, he headed for the Maine coast. Once more alone in his seaworthy little ketch, he cruised along the coast by easy stages, northward and eastward, farther and farther from the crowded habitats of man, to the spruce-clad rocky islands off Maine. Off Seguin he stood well out to sea, the gentle rocking of the boat on the ocean swell lulling him into a happy reverie as she glided along before the summer breeze. Passing the Georges and the endless labyrinth of islands in Penobscot Bay, he came at last to Mount Desert Island, where Mortimer, breaking away from his desk in Washington, joined him for a cruise into the unfrequented waters beyond the Schoodic. Here there are bays and harbors seldom visited by the great stream of cruising yachts, where, over dense forests of spruce that rise from the water's edge along a rugged shoreline, great ospreys wheel and scream, and in countless mossy nooks in the depth of the wood, close by the sound of the surf, the witchery of nature's solitude casts a spell over the lonely wanderer. Into such a bay, as the gorgeous summer afternoon drew to a close, the Petrel steered her course, her sails beginning to droop as the breeze gave way to the calm of evening. Two happy men sat lazily in her cockpit, gazing over the placid water into the enchanted forest that lined the shore ahead of them. Through the day, while bounding over the sparkling blue waves, their talk had drifted on as the spirit moved them from one phase of the war to another. Evans delighted Mortimer with his pictures of the life in the Navy and sidelights on the various admirals and others who had figured in the official doings. He told of his talk with Fraser in the Borgia Garden and the conferences that followed, tales which never reached another mortal ear. The opal tints of approaching sunset were playing in kaleidoscopic reflection on the restless surface of the water, and the dying zephyr just sufficed to give the Petrel steerage way as she headed for a snug little cove among the spruce trees. The conversation had drifted through all phases of the war to the final action, and Mortimer was for the first time receiving a clear exposition of the underlying strategy and tactics. Evans explained how the placing of every unit of the fleet was worked out to ensure the greatest strength in case of every conceivable unforeseen contingency, and how, guided by the mastermind of Fraser, Admiral Johnson's fighting spirit had driven home the decisive blow. The sun had set, and both sea and sky were aflame with gorgeous colors, while the dark, pointed spruce trees on the shore, now close at hand, cast mobile reflections dancing on the undulating surface of the cove. The anchor splashed, and the chain rattled down, and then the sails were lowered and furled for the night. Late into the twilight, the two comrades sat watching the colors fade in sea and sky as the great chapter of history just closed was unfolded in reminiscence before them. "Jim," said Mortimer, "I know you prefer to work in the dark, but it makes me uncomfortable to have you go without recognition. I want to have some open acknowledgement of the nation's gratitude to you, to ease my own feelings. Would you mind if I did something about it?" Evans gave his friend a look that spoke his depth of friendship. "I am well content as it is," he said. "That is something of a boast, and sometimes I don't live up to it. But I know that in my better moods I'm not bothered that way. The pleasure of praise tends to cloy. Please give recognition to my better self, and let the reward be always, as now, in the doing." The end. End of Chapter 15. End of The Radio Gunner by Alexander Forbes.